Hello everyone, welcome along to Live on Air again. I'm David Bell and I've got with me Elizabeth Davies sitting here and Max Thompson live on air from his place. And tonight we're doing the topic, it's called Scorpio Rising. And Scorpio Rising indicates that it's the start of autumn heading towards winter, and how we go about preparing our worship services and how we go about preparing our sermons becomes a different kind of exercise at this stage of the year from all the holiday period, the build-up from holidays through to Easter. It's a Southern Hemisphere thing, Scorpio rising, and we've got the majority of the Christian year taking place through autumn, into winter, and then into early spring, the opposite of the northern season worship festivals. So let's, without any further ado, ask each of our participants to very briefly say a couple of sentences about themselves. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Oh, hi. I am a worship leader at my local church. I'm a retired pharmacist, and now I have lots of grandchildren to run around, look after.
That's lovely, thank you.
Yes, and I'm Max Thompson. I'm a retired telecommunications engineer, a member of the local parish council, and from time to time lead worship at some of our services.
Right, now I should say that both Max and Elizabeth are really good sorts in the fact that I've asked them both on occasion to, in the past, to step in and lead worship. I asked Elizabeth quite unexpectedly to, from her perspective, to start taking sermons at one stage when in the life of our congregation we needed some extra input both in terms of preaching and worship leading. So both Max and Elizabeth are well versed in the idea of leading worship and perhaps taking sermons. And that's going to be our main focus tonight. I'd like to bring up our screen share for the evening and just present that to everyone. This gives roughly what we're going to look at. It's a planning session tonight, a planning guide for preaching and worship leading. And we're going to look at 5 topics. These topics are know your audience, know yourself, know your subject, communicate with confidence, and seek feedback. Now, they come together in a very neat package called the art and craft of telling the Christian story. And the PDF, as we work through it tonight, will be available if you're in Kiwi Connection. You'll be able to download the PDF, and it's a lovely little app that takes you to a series of videos and resources where all the things that we talk about in our introduction tonight are examined in a little more detail. So this is a straightforward way of taking us through the art and craft of telling the Christian story, which is a kind of a shorthand way of saying not sermons. The emphasis is less on sermons and less on preaching and more on telling the Christian story. So without any further ado, let me just go through to the very first thing that we want to talk about tonight, and that is knowing the audience, knowing the congregation in terms of telling the Christian story. And I'd like to kick off by introducing the fact that today in our very media savvy world, we've got a great many ways of connecting with people. We can do it off Facebook, we can do it off YouTube, Google+, Twitter, Pinterest. There's a seemingly almost endless list of new forms of social media that engage us And yet somehow at the same time, we don't necessarily seem to know our congregation as well as we should. So I'm just wondering if either Max or Elizabeth has got any tips on knowing the congregation. And I see we've got, at present, we've got 3 viewers in. If you've got some tips on how to know your congregation or your audience better, we'd be delighted if you'd feed those in the question and answer pod. So maybe, Max, could I put you on the spot first of all? Do you think, as a worship leader, you know your audience? Do you know your congregation?
Yes, I think there's 2 distinct environments for that. One is when it is the local congregation, when I feel quite comfortable that I do know the members of the congregation because I've been with them for, well, since 1990 pretty well. But there are other situations one can find oneself in where you don't know the audience in detail, such as making a comment on Facebook or Google. You don't really know who you're talking to at all. So you've got 2 different situations.
And you're comfortable when you know your congregation or audience, and maybe less comfortable if you don't know them.
It's hard to say too clearly on that, because you know you're going into a different environment where you don't know your audience, then you respond accordingly. Whereas knowing your congregation, in the case of our local church, then it's quite different and you can approach it differently. Doesn't mean the confidence is different, but certainly the way you do it is different.
You got any comments about that, Elizabeth?
I think if you were going to a church in which you did not know who was going to be there, you would need to find out if you had children, for instance, or what the average age was, just to get some sort of a handle on it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, particularly with lay preachers in rural and provincial situations who are often called on to go out and preach at new congregations. They have to somehow, as you rightly say, get a handle on what's the makeup of the audience. I've often been caught, for example, I have a children's talk prepared, but there are no children in the congregation. And when I say to the congregation, I've got a children's talk prepared, sometimes they say, oh, we'll do it anyway. And then at the end of the service, they may not comment on the sermon at all, but they'll say, nice children's talk. And you know, that's really quite interesting from an ego point of view. That the thing that you put most effort into, which was the sermon, didn't communicate as well as something that you might not have put quite as much effort into. And that tells me that if I really do know the audience, I will start to craft the content of the worship event, whether it's the sermon or whether it's worship leading. I'll start to craft that content differently according to context. Now, tonight we had hoped that we'd have a beginning preacher in the live on-air broadcast, but unfortunately Peter Lane fell ill and Max has stepped in at sort of quick notice there to fill that gap. But that young preacher was going to look at their first sermon ever, and it was going to be in the context of a youth service. So the context of a youth service, I suspect, would be different from the context at your local congregation.
It could be, but anything that you do for children has to have an underlying aspect that appeals to the adult. But I think you can't just make something babyish for children. It's got to have a double double content.
I think there's a real learning point there from my perspective, and I believe for some time that while it's nominally to the children, it's really trying to communicate to the whole congregation, but including the children if there are any. And so therefore there is something about your comment, David, that often you will hear the comment that people remember the children's address more than the sermon. So there's something to learn from that.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong learning point out of that. And over a lifetime of Christian ministry and preaching in very different contexts, the thing that I've come to realize is that the way we structure our services, the actual leading of the worship, is probably totally counterproductive to getting the real engagement with the younger members of the congregation. And I much prefer what happens in the Suzuki music environment, where the more advanced pupils perform their pieces at the start of a concert, and the less advanced ones, the beginners, the juniors, gradually join in until the final part of the concert is always around the simplest piece. Now, if you think about how we structure our worship services, they work in the reverse order. We deal with the children first, as if somehow the message to them is less important than the message to the adults. And in the traditional way of a Sunday school, after you'd had the children's school, the children would go out and have their lessons as if that was separate from worship. When I was a very young boy, and my father attended a local Baptist church in Grey Lynn in Auckland, and I therefore attended the local Baptist Sunday school in Grey Lynn in Auckland. We did Sunday school at 9 o'clock, and church started at 10 o'clock, and we were expected to go into the worship service for the children's talk as the end of our Sunday event. So that's a very different kind of experience.
Reflecting on that, David, do you think it worked in terms of effective sequence?
I don't know whether it worked in terms of sequence, but I ended up becoming a Methodist minister, so I suppose that it had some kind of effect. Whether that was a good effect or a bad effect, it depends whether you're a Baptist or a Methodist, I suppose, as to whether it was good or bad. Let's move on to the next point that we want to make. I think it's obvious that we've got to know our audience and know that we tailor the message for different age groups and different social contexts. Our next slide is really about how well do we know ourselves. And I'd like to highlight a quotation from Dr. J.J. Lewis, who was a former principal of Trinity Theological College. He said, "In a rapidly changing world, the only positive and healthy attitude to adopt is that of faith." Now, I think that's a great introduction to knowing yourself. Are we able to have a healthy and creative, positive attitude to change? Do we know ourselves well enough to craft the Christian story around the rapidly changing world? And so let's just put this out to Max first of all. What do you make of the idea that in knowing yourself, you also have to learn to be positive and affirming of the congregation? What do you make of that, Max?
I certainly agree with the affirming. It doesn't do any good for anyone if you belittle yourself, and it certainly does do good when you reinforce the positive in the congregation. So knowing how you react yourself to things helps you, hopefully, to do the right thing by your listeners and the congregation, so that you are affirming the aspects that you know in yourself.
Yeah, if we're not affirming of the congregation, there's something we don't know about ourselves. Is another way of looking at it. Because the congregation essentially are volunteers. We're all volunteers, as the Salvation Army says. We're all in it together. We're all volunteers, and therefore we have to work with the positive qualities of volunteers. Now, that can involve some difficulties, I think, for worship leading, because often worship leaders don't really look at their own need for praise and recognition. Elizabeth, would you like to comment on that?
I was really thinking that there could be, or there is, a lot of things that you don't actually know about. You could be blind to the various faults that you're committing when you are a worship leader. You need, well, you do need to have somebody to tell you, well, you're not doing this right, or I didn't hear what you said, or something. You need to have somebody tell you what you aren't doing right.
Okay, that's a fair comment, that you need someone to tell you what you are not doing right, but you also do need someone to tell you what you are doing right. Because I think that what happens in a lot of cases is that people have led a service of worship, they've preached a sermon, but the positive qualities that went into that aren't necessarily understood by the preacher. In other words, they tend to put themselves down rather than understanding that they've done something really quite positive, that group. Now, just as I'm saying that, I'm aware that we've got 3 or 4 concurrent viewers. So if you've got any comments and questions, please do feed them in through the question and answer pod. And you'll also see, if you come in through the Google Plus event page, that you can, there's a little thumbs up or thumbs down. So if anyone's making a comment that you particularly agree with, giving the thumbs up or the thumbs down, or if you disagree with them, is actually a very helpful form of feedback in itself, because we go back and we look at what your feedback was so that we can build it in to making better quality events. So, having said that, Max, what do you think about the need for constructive criticism in terms of knowing yourself?
It's definitely very helpful to get feedback, and the closer the person is to you giving it, the better. If it's someone you don't know well, you can take it the wrong way. Whereas if it is someone close to you that you know well, then it's really helpful to adjust and try and learn from it.
There's, Elizabeth, there's a comment on the sheet that said there's no perfect 10 out of 10 score for worship leading. What do you think of that?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Something always turns up that you didn't mean to happen.
Yeah, there's always the unexpected. There's things that you suddenly realise in worship that you might have wanted to structure differently. But the art of it is to simply move on and let the event do its own work. So,
what I'm very conscious of too, David, is the fact that it will be different for different people. There may be some in the congregation that will give you 10 out of 10, while others will give you 5 out of 10 or less. So you can't always get it right for all the people. It's a case of maximizing the number if you can.
Yeah, that's a really interesting comment, Max. Do you aim to satisfy the bulk of people there, or do you aim to satisfy some sort of inner vision about how the worship should be?
I guess a blend of that it would be my answer. That yes, you are wanting to maximize the number that find it useful, but you're also trying to achieve something that you know you want to achieve, and you're not just purely targeting what you perceive they're wanting.
Yeah, that's a pretty wise answer, I think, Max. There is no perfect score for worship leading and preaching, and it will vary from time to time and congregation to congregation. So let's move on into the next slide, which is about knowing your subject, crafting the Christian story. You've got to know your audience, you've got to know yourself, but how about knowing your subject? Now, people that know me well would say that in my opinion, the single most important thing that a worship leader and a preacher can do is honest preparation. But preparation, I don't think, will get you the whole way through in terms of a worship event. I think beyond preparation, once you know your subject, you've actually got to rehearse it. Now, how do both of you feel about this idea of rehearsing?
I would certainly say that there are some aspects, thinking now more of worship leading than just the preaching, there are some aspects of it that are worth practicing, rehearsing, so that you can fine-tune a little bit, because almost always when you do it the first time through, you think, oh, I really could do that a little bit better there or there. So it is worth rehearsing.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. I think if you are wanting to read something, you need to read it as if it's spoken, not as if it's written, as if it's to be read. And you need to look at the sieg that comes in between various parts of the service, so that you add the little introduction, or you complete something before you go on to something else. It's got to be seamless.
Yeah, that sort of segue effect of moving it through. And you can't get that, can you, Elizabeth, without some kind of rehearsal there?
No, you do have to read aloud.
Yeah.
Several times.
Yeah, several times. Sometimes we get people in worship that stand up and do Bible readings, and they're not clearly prepared for it. And so that then becomes a more difficult exercise. One of the best Bible readings I've ever heard was delivered by a man that had only just learnt to read. And when I say just learnt to read, if I look at that list, he would say prepare, rehearse. And he read the Bible like that, and the congregation stood up and applauded him at the end of his reading, because he was an adult who had finally broken through the reading barrier, and everyone appreciated him. But when you've got people that can read well but don't rehearse, then you get the opposite sort of effect. So I think that's an important thing, is that segue that Elizabeth mentioned. There's also, I think, part of knowing your subject includes knowing your audience, and that means you know your subject and you can involve the audience. Now, I'm going to give a direct example from this morning's worship. Max and Elizabeth and I all go to the same congregation. We got an email from Elizabeth asking us to think earlier in the week about the conversion experience. And there is a mechanism for involving the congregation before they get to the worship event. And I really appreciated the fact that I had some idea of what the sermon might be around. It turned out that the sermon wasn't so much around that, but that was certainly the message of part of the readings of the scriptures today. So there was, if you like, there was involvement ahead of time, and I think that's a tremendously important part of this idea of knowing your subject, because you will start to involve people in the subject well before the worship event. Possibly the most difficult area of all is this idea of editing. Now, how many, let me ask the viewers if they'd like to feed in, how many of you edit your worship services and your sermons, I mean, go through with a fine-tooth comb before the rehearsal? Dare I ask, Max and Elizabeth, how strict is your editing pencil in that preparation period?
Well, for me, that's a real benefit of working as a couple, because what I do, Julie can edit and make suggestions and vice versa, so that for us, that editing function is quite real.
And also in my pharmacy career, I was an editor, and so my skills are honed, and I hone them on everything I write. So I have to be careful not to end up with not as much material as I need.
Well, that's a really interesting thing. Elizabeth, as an editor, had a professional capacity to work through very fine detail. You were editing pharmaceutical journals for the medical profession, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So that editing eye becomes really quite critical. And that's where, if I may say so, when I see a service of worship leading with Max and Julie and Elizabeth, I know that there will have been very careful editing, very careful preparation, very careful rehearsal of the material, so that we don't get a lot of superfluous stuff in the worship event. And I think that's tremendous capacity, and it's one that worship leaders really should, I think, consider. Now, for the person doing their first time ever sermon, if you're sitting down to write a sermon, maybe you've got some grand vision of becoming a Christian minister and you've got to do a critique service or whatever, and that first sermon or even the second or third sermon becomes quite important in your life, the best possible advice that you can give is that use the editing pencil over and over again. In making a sermon, hone it so that it's finely polished. And whether you're like I am, that can preach at the drop of a hat, it may look effortless, but most people don't realize how many hours and days of work have gone into it. Yeah. So just for example's sake, here am I, well past, heading rapidly into retirement. The last sermon that I preached in our local congregation took me 2.5 days to prepare, and it had an enormous amount of editing. It was done entirely from memory and the heart, but all the editing was in the printed material that was then handed out. And that handout became my summary, if you like, of what I was doing for that particular Sunday. So if I can just bring the screen share back up again. And you see, sermons and worship leading require summarizing. The summary comes perhaps in the delivery, the summary may come after the delivery, but somehow or other you've got to capture the event in just a few words, just a few sentences. So that, Max, if I said to you, can you tell me what was the theme of the last subject you prepared worship for?
I'm afraid I can't put a finger on that because it was many weeks ago.
Because you do a lot of preparations. But Elizabeth, how about you?
The one before this, you mean?
Yes.
No, can't remember.
Can't remember. Now,
Got to allow for our aging memory.
Oh, yeah. And also you've got to allow for a very, very rude question and a very unpolished question. What I'm getting at here is that I can't summarize. I can tell you what I did for the last sermon, but I can't tell you for the one before. But if I've prepared a summary and I've prepared the worship service, I've prepared the sermon so that they can be shared in those social media, I can actually get round the problem of memory and say, my goodness, I can't remember, that's my age, but I will be able to give you a summary of it if we can just Google it. And that brings us, if you like, all the way back to our first or second slide, telling the Christian story. Knowing your audience at a local level is fantastic because it allows you to shape and to craft. But why take just the local congregation seriously when with that little bit of extra work, the thing can appear on Facebook, YouTube, Google+, Twitter, in a variety, websites, in a variety of places. And so knowing your audience and being able to expand the audience, knowing yourself and being able to craft the Christian story so that enough of yourself is going forward into a congregation beyond the local, knowing your subject enough to be able to not only prepare, rehearse, involve, edit, but to summarize and to deliver in multiple ways. So that's quite a bit different from where we started out. And I think this is the art and craft of telling the Christian story today. It's no longer just about what we did at the local level. It's become something more. Everything we say and do today is tracked electronically in one form or another, whether it's our bank statements, our tax statements, our social networks, etc. How important is it to be able to craft the Christian story in such a way that your art form, you put all of that careful preparation into worship leading or preparing a sermon, and why should it now be lost? That's really what I think the art and craft of telling the Christian story is all about today. So let me bring that slide share back up and let's just ask your opinions about this. Max, do you expect and plan for outcomes like I've just been suggesting? Do you see your worship leading as ending up on Facebook?
Well, in practical terms, I haven't in the past because the mechanism hasn't been there. But certainly the potential to reach all those people that will never come inside the church building is far, far greater if you can use today's communication environment, as you mentioned. And it does beg the question as to whether a congregation should think about that and plan to, rather than just relying on the odd church being broadcast on TV, to actually do something about the media that's available.
Yeah, I agree. Elizabeth, any comments?
Yes. Of course, that is done on a Sunday morning on TV quite extensively. Certainly, one of the local churches in our area has been doing that for quite a while. Shore Community.
Oh yeah. And most churches have a website where they can put up this week's sermon, etc. But I wonder whether we actually expect and plan for outcomes around that. Because I think what goes on at present is simply a hit and miss method. Oh, would you like to put the PowerPoint up, or would you like to put the sermon up, or the prayers up, without necessarily expecting and planning for outcomes from that. So let me just give a very concrete example of that. We've been running live on air now since June or July 2015. It hasn't broadcast every Sunday evening, but we've had a great variety of topics in it, and also a great variety of presenters. I think we're well over 20, maybe I can't remember, let's say 20 presenters plus. And each one of them has brought something different, and I've taken the opportunity to promote those live on airs, as has, for example, Stuart McAdam from Cinema Addicts, CEO of Cinema Addicts, and in our congregation. So something like the topics we've done from this live broadcast in terms of talking about movies have had over 2,000 views. They've had many thousands of watched minutes. We've been able to chop some of those longer YouTube broadcasts up into small segments. So one that I did with Stuart McAdam, we planned that the series of questions could be chopped up into 1 and 2 minute videos, and there are 15 of them sitting up in the YouTube channel, and now in Kiwi Connection in the creative spaces. So if you want to look at something, come back again and again because you think a powerful insight might have been shared, and yeah, it's all there for you. And so my point is that in today's day and age, the person that is starting to learn to preach or learn to lead worship has to expect and plan for outcomes in terms of social media. Now, that's unexpected, but I can't see the Christian church surviving unless it does do that. The second point here is this takes us back into the context of the local congregation. I think if to be confident about crafting the Christian message, we have to help people find what they've lost. Any comments about that one, either Elizabeth or Max? Help people find what they've lost.
Yes, and in some cases that's true, that people in their past have had things which they've now lost, and you can help them find it. But there's the corollary of that you're hopefully helping people find what they've never found before, and not just what they've lost.
That's a pretty clever answer, Max. I'll chop that up from this YouTube video and put that up as one of the wise words for the future. Absolutely. That is part of the aim, well put, of Christian preaching, isn't it? To help discover what you didn't know that you didn't know.
Indeed.
But did you also mean that perhaps there are people who have been through Sunday school, Bible class, etc., and are now not involved in a Christian community? What they've lost? You mean that sort of thing, that what they might have had and then they've let go?
Well, I think that's part of it too, that often we do let things go. We let things drift, don't we? So that our children move away from religion, from Christian faith, They do that as a process of becoming their own person, but in becoming their own person, they also lose something of what they once were. And I do think, yes, people do. The part of coming to church is helping people find that aspect.
And yes, and to find an adult faith
of their own.
Of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another unexpected outcome, but we have to plan for it, is to expect the unexpected from your words. Now, expecting the unexpected doesn't always mean something positive. It can mean something negative. You may have the best will in the world as a preacher or a worship leader, but someone is going to take it the wrong way. And I think Max made mention of that earlier on. There's never the perfect worship score of 10 out of 10. There's always the potential for 3 out of 10 and 4 out of 10 because someone took it unexpectedly the wrong way. But the reverse also is true, that you can expect some things from your words to be incredibly positive, to have the potential to change people's lives later on. I'd like to flip over to the next one, Max. Offer the wisdom of Christian community in worship leading. Anything that you would want to say about that, offering the wisdom of the community?
Just what comes to mind there is that we should be looking at the issues of the day, how they're affecting people, and bring the Christian values, Christian thought to them. So, and yes, that's where the Christian can contribute to the community at large amongst perhaps a majority of non-Christian.
Okay, that's an interesting one. Elizabeth, how do you react to offering the wisdom of Christian community in worship?
I think it would have to be something that came from the person affected. The wisdom that might come from the service or whatever would be very idiosyncratic. It would be very much related to the person who heard it, so that you can offer all sorts of wisdom that you don't know which one's going to hit the mark.
Okay, I was thinking more here in terms of the community that gathers at worship, the Sunday morning congregation, or the community that gathers around a study group or a social action program. As a community, it has a collective wisdom to offer to the individual. And I don't see many services of worship where the wisdom of the community is offered to the individuals of the community. So, for example, in the prayer situation, we pray for others at our worship, but the wisdom of the community might want to take that a step further in terms of how we then plan for outcomes from those prayers. Does that make sense?
Yes. Pray for something, but then do something about it.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And I think by doing that, we work a kind of a magic by putting humanity first in every situation in worship. So it's not about holding up doctrine in your first sermon or your last sermon. It's not about holding up doctrine in the service of worship. Those things don't work any magic at all. They get in the way of community. So let's come to our final slide. We're just a little over time, so we'll do this fairly quickly. The photo here is of Martin Luther King. This is in the Washington, D.C. Memorial Park, the magnificent avenue that you walk down, and this huge stone statue of Martin Luther King. Coming out from that statue, the preacher who's going to transform America with his I Have a Dream speech. And it seems to me that we can seek feedback, crafting the Christian story, by going to people like Martin Luther King, watching their sermons, watching how they did it, and asking, how did you do that? How did you work that magic with that set of words? So individually, next time that you have to write a speech, deliver a sermon or a worship credit, start by giving some feedback. Go and give yourself some feedback. How could I improve that? Go to some of the great thinkers, leaders in the Christian setting and ask, how would I improve that? Why did they say what they said? So that eventually you're walking with the great thinkers, the great preachers, the great doers of Christian faith. And by asking the question of their input, you have the ability to improve your own input. Any comments about that to sort of wrap it up, Max?
Just an analogy that comes to mind. When I listened to the Salvation Army public relations person who does the research, it gave me the feedback that I felt I wanted to carry through into the congregation. That's a case of getting feedback from outside and hopefully bringing it inside the community, the local community.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Elizabeth, have you got any sort of final wrap-up comments of the whole evening tonight? Anything in particular you would like to draw out from tonight's session?
That last comment was interesting because I do a lot of reading, and then thinking about what other people have said, which has helped to put things together for me. So yes, I think.
Oh, well, if you're thinking that by getting that sort of feedback going, that feedback loop going, that it helps improve what you're doing. Yeah. And I mean, I honestly can't think of anything better for beginning preachers to do than to read other people's sermons. Now, the art Scorpio rising, as we've been doing the live broadcast, Scorpio will have come up in the eastern sky a bit, and the whole of the Milky Way, the constellations up there, will be telling a story in the sky. And that's what I think the art and craft of telling the Christian story is all about today. It's a story that has to take place in the cloud of IT. But that IT gets earthed out into real, live, ordinary congregations. They may be small, they may be large, they may be elderly, they may be Protestant, they may be Pentecostal, they may be Catholic. All of these congregations are feeding off this incredible story of the gospel, and it's located in a gigantic information cloud that encircles the planet, that encircles our thoughts, that encircles our hearts. And the idea of the art and craft of telling the Christian story is to take that message of the heart, that message of the gospel, to refine and edit and put it into the simplest possible terms so that it can communicate the most to the group that we know best, and then by further summarizing, by further refinement, to enable that to then go out in the world of IT and add to the store of knowledge that encircles the globe. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Elizabeth. We'll say good night at this point, and we'll say see you again next week. Thanks for watching.
Good night.
Good night.